The north is cold and full of whispers.
Before we begin, if you want exclusive timelines and members-only content you won't find anywhere on YouTube, the link to our Patreon is in the description. 3 Kingsguard lay dead in the red sand below. Ned Stark climbed the stairs without looking back at them. He had known of Arthur Dayne since he was a boy, had heard the singers, and the men speak of the Sword of the Morning, in the way men speak of things they will remember until they die, had listened to knights describe him with the particular reverence reserved for things that existed at the outer edge of what men could be. Ned had fought that man this afternoon, or what amounted to the same thing, and he did not think about it now. There was a door at the top of the stairs. He could hear his sister's voice behind it, calling his name. The room smelled of blood and candle wax, and the iron smell of a woman who had been in labor for a long time, and whose labor was finally done. Lyanna lay against a nest of pillows that had once been white. She was smaller than he remembered her. She had always seemed enormous to Ned, fierce and fast, with their father's laugh and a stubbornness that belonged entirely to herself, and now she was small. And her face was the color of old parchment, and her eyes were the eyes of a woman who has been running a very long time, and has finally stopped. She held the child against her chest. Ned crossed the room and looked at his nephew for the first time, and what he saw stopped him mid-step. The baby was large, not in the way that a healthy newborn is sometimes large, pink, and unremarkably robust. This child was long-limbed, heavy in the bones, his hands already outsized against Lyanna's wrist where she cradled him. He was minutes old. He had the proportions of a child 2 or 3 months along. His eyes, when they found Ned's face, were gray, but not the dark gray of the Starks, not the color Ned had seen in his own mirror his entire life. Something lighter, something Ned could not name, and they held his gaze with a steadiness that was wrong for a newborn, in ways he could not articulate and did not try to. Lyanna spoke. Her voice was almost gone. She told him the name. She made him swear. She made him swear twice, because the first time his voice broke on the oath and she needed to hear it without the break in it. He swore. By the time he finished, she was gone. Ned took the child. He stood in the silent room with the boy in his arms, and the 3 dead Kingsguard in the sand below, and 6 more dead friends somewhere in his memory of the last several hours, and he made a decision that would cost him the rest of his life to maintain. He carried the child down the stairs and into the Dornish sun, and began the long journey north. He arrived with a bastard boy, and a story about a woman named Willa. Catelyn Tully Stark received this in the great hall with her spine straight and her face composed, the way she had been trained since childhood to receive difficult things. She said nothing cruel. She chose her questions carefully, and the ones she chose. Ned answered in the brief clipped manner of a man who has decided in advance how much he will say, but she looked at the child. 1 month old, and he held his head up. She asked Maester Luwin that evening. Luwin examined Jon with the methodical care of a man who had attended 30 births, and recognized that something here did not match his experience. He smiled at her afterward and called it exceptional development, and wrote it in his record with the precision of a man who suspects the record may someday be read by someone who matters. He offered no explanation, because he had none. At 3 months, Catelyn was briefly required to hold Jon, and she felt him press his weight down into her arms and anchor himself there, not squirm, not lean. Anchor, the way a stone settles into mortar, and look around the room with those gray eyes, as though taking inventory. At 8 months, Jon stood in the center of the nursery and walked. He did not toddle. He stood and found his balance and walked, and Catelyn watched from the doorway and said nothing to anyone for 3 days. At age 3, Jon stood as tall as Robb at 4. At 5, he was broader through the shoulder than the grown soldier who served as Theon Greyjoy's guardian, a man who had seen war, who looked at Jon once across the yard and then looked at the wall behind him and did not look back. At 7, a serving girl brought Jon a chair for his evening meal. She set it down, straightened up, and looked across the table at the child sitting opposite a child of 7 years, with a 7-year-old's face and a 7-year-old's serious eyes, and understood, slowly, that she had brought a chair for a body the size of a fully armored knight. She left without taking it back. It sat there, unused. Jon ate standing. At 9. He had to turn sideways through the older doorways of Winterfell's inner keep. The castle adjusted around him, not at once quietly, the way a river adjusts its course around a new stone, a little more each season. Doorframes were widened, furniture was reinforced or quietly replaced. Sir Roderick Castle, who had been training young men in Winterfell's yard for 20 years, and who was too professional to show discomfort, visited the smithy one morning and returned with a warhammer handle wrapped in leather. It was not elegant, it did not splinter. The headaches had begun at 7 and did not stop. They came without pattern and without mercy behind the left eye most often, or across the base of the skull in a band of pressure that sometimes took his vision on one side for minutes at a time. Maester Luwin called them vascular events and wrote down the frequency. Old Nan called them the god's burden and declined to elaborate when Ned pressed her. Jon called them nothing. He had never woken to a morning without the background hum of one, low and constant, which meant the absence of it would have felt stranger than its presence. He learned to work through them. He had no other choice. The incident with the horse happened on an ordinary afternoon in the stable yard. A draft animal, one of the big northern animals, bred for the cold, weighing the better part of a ton, stepped on Jon's left foot. Jon did not shout. He reached down, placed both hands under the animal's rear quarter, and pushed. The horse's hindquarters lifted briefly from the ground. The horse scrambled sideways with the sound of pure animal alarm and stood trembling 8 feet away with its ears flat. And when the noise of its hooves had settled, the stable yard was very still. Catelyn had been crossing the yard. She went to Ned Solar that night and closed the door and told him what she had seen, and waited for him to tell her something that made sense. He set down the letter he was reading. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the fire in the hearth cracked twice in the silence. "I know what Jon is," he said. "Then tell me." "I can't." "Not all of it. Not yet." He set his hands flat on the desk. "But Cat, the world will need what Jon is. I need you to trust me." "What you're asking me to trust," she said, "is that a 9-year-old boy who lifts horses is something I should accept and say nothing about." "Yes, that isn't enough, Ned, I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She left. He did not go after her. After that, she kept Sansa away from the yard when Jon trained, and neither of them spoke of the horse again. Robb Stark was a fine young fighter, and the record should note this clearly, because it matters. He was not a talented boy playing at swords. He was a skilled young man who had been trained properly, who had his father's instinct for footwork and his mother's disciplined refusal to be outworked, and who hit hard for his age. When he and Jon sparred in Winterfell's yard on the afternoon of the incident, Robb was not losing. He was landing touches. He was competitive, pressing, alive with the specific pride of a boy who has fought his way to something that might be called an edge. Jon was holding back. He was always holding back. The headache arrived at the third exchange, not the background hum, but the other kind. The kind that came in like a fist closing around the inside of the skull. Jon knew this feeling. He knew it meant the calibration was going. He stepped back and opened his mouth to say he was done for the day. Robb pressed forward. He did not understand. There was no reason he should have understood. What he saw was his brother slowing down. And Robb Stark did not stop when his opponent slowed down. He attacked. Jon saw it coming and tried to respond at a fraction of his real speed, and could not manage it. His depth perception had gone on the left side, as it always did at the peak, and the calibration was wrong, and he swung. Half speed. Restrained, controlled, as much as he could control anything with one eye dark and the headache at its worst. The practice sword in Robb's hands shattered at the hilt. Robb's arm went sideways with a sound like green wood, cracking a single sharp report that bounced off the courtyard walls, and came back, and Robb sat down hard in the dirt and did not get back up. Jon was on his knees beside him before the echo finished. He pressed Robb's hand between both of his, bent over him, and cried. Not quietly. He was 12 years old, and his brother was sitting in the cold mud with his arm at an angle it was not made to hold, and the headache was still there, grinding, relentless, and Jon cried the way the wind comes off the mountains, without apology, without stopping until it was done. Ned found him sitting beneath the heart tree, his back against the white bark, his knees drawn up. The direwolf pups were a heap of gray fur against his side, The carved face of the weirwood bled its red sap into the roots in silence. Jon had been crying and was not anymore. The headache had leveled back to its familiar low register. Robb's arm was set and splinted, and Robb had told him through his teeth that it was an accident, that he knew it was an accident, that Jon needed to stop looking at him like that. Jon had nodded and said nothing and come here. Ned sat down beside him and waited. "What am I?" Jon asked. His voice was flat, not angry. He was 12 years old, and had asked the easier version of this question, who was my mother at younger ages, and learned to stop asking. This question was different. This was not a question about a name. "Why does my head split like that?" Jon said. "Why am I built the way I am? Why does a swing I can barely feel break Robb's arm?" He looked at Ned. His gray eyes were dry now and very steady. "I need to know what I am." Ned sat with the question for a long moment. The godswood held its silence. Somewhere in the dark a wolf moved through the underbrush and was gone. "You are what you were made to be, Jon," Ned said, "and when the time comes, the world will need every inch of what you are." He held his nephew's gaze. "That is the only answer I can give you." Jon looked at him. He considered pushing. He could see in Ned's face that there was more, that there had always been more, that the answer Ned was giving him was a true thing surrounded on all sides by things he was not prepared to say. Jon was 12 years old, and he was not stupid, and he knew the difference between a lie and a withheld truth. He accepted it anyway. Not peacefully. Permanently, he did not ask again. The royal column arrived on a gray morning in late autumn, and the household guard of King Robert Baratheon, professional men, veterans of 11 regions and 30 years of royal service, men who maintained their formation and their faces, and the particular composure of soldiers, who understand that their bearing reflects their king's dignity, lost their rhythm inside 30 seconds of riding. Through the gate. Jon stood in the courtyard with Ned and Robb and the household, dressed in northern leathers, bare-headed in the cold. The effect of him on the arriving riders was not subtle. The column did not stop. It slowed. The lead riders drifted fractionally inward, unconsciously, the way cattle adjust their direction around a sound they do not understand. A sergeant in the third rank leaned toward the man beside him and said something. The man's expression said the rest. Robert Baratheon saw Jon from 30 yards out and laughed. Not the laugh a king deploys at formal occasions to signal that something has been received as amusing. A real one, a great booming sound that broke off the walls of Winterfell's yard and came back louder, as though the stone had found it funny too. Robert was still a formidable physical specimen, broader in the chest than most men regardless of the weight the years had added, and when he laughed, the front rank of his guard visibly relaxed. If the king was laughing, the thing in the yard was not a danger. Ned Stark, who had spent 15 years deciding what to tell the world about the thing in the yard, thought, "Robert has always been wrong about what constitutes a danger." The formal greeting took half an hour. Robert embraced Ned and was loud about it. He assessed Robb with the eye of a man who prizes the results of good breeding. He was appropriately gracious to Lady Stark and the younger children. Through all of it, his gaze returned to Jon the way a compass needle returns to north, not rudely, not with the gawking curiosity of the common soldiers, but with the focused interest of a man who spends his life cataloging fighters the way other men catalog horses. "I want to speak to the boy," he said, during the walk from the yard to the great hall, without looking at Ned when he said it. Ned began a sentence about Jon's afternoon obligations. "Alone," Robert said. "The two of us. Your hall, your terms. But I want the room." Ned's jaw tightened. It had a specific way of doing this when an argument had already been lost. Robert had learned to read it at 17, and it had not changed. They used a chamber off the great hall, fireplace, 2 chairs that were built for ordinary men, which meant Jon stood near the window while Robert sat, and Robert's attendants withdrew, and the door closed. Robert studied Jon with the unhurried attention of a man taking inventory. "How many men can you take in a hallway?" he asked. Jon did not hesitate. "All of them." Robert's grin was the widest thing in the room. He leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of headaches do you get?" A brief shift in Jon's posture, not a flinch. Something smaller, an acknowledgement that the question had arrived from an unexpected direction. "They come and they end," he said. "I've learned to work through them." "In a fight?" "Sometimes." "And when they come in a fight?" "I fight through them." Robert sat back and studied him with something that had stopped being casual curiosity some minutes ago. "Sir Gregor Clegane gets headaches," he said. "Lifelong bad ones, from what I understand. The maesters have no explanation." "I've heard of Sir Gregor," Jon said. A short silence settled. Neither of them said anything further about Sir Gregor. Neither of them needed to. "You'll come south with us," Robert said. "I'll inform your father." He rose from the chair, a slower process than it once was. "One more thing. My Lannister boy, finest sword in the Seven Kingdoms, or so he tells himself, and he's not entirely wrong. He's been in the same castle with you for 3 hours. He was almost at the door. I want to see it." Jaime Lannister agreed to the exhibition bout with the ease of a man who has not thought seriously about losing in over a decade. He was extraordinary in the way that things built purely for function sometimes are no wasted movement, no decorative gesture, the calibrated economy of a man whose entire body had been 20 years in the shaping. He carried a blunted longsword loose in his right hand and stood across the yard from Jon and rolled his shoulder once and waited, with the green-eyed amusement of someone who has already decided how this concludes. The yard had filled. Servants, guardsmen, household knights, half the king's retinue, everyone had found a reason to be near the training yard. Ned stood at the gate. He had his arms at his sides and his face composed into a particular blankness that cost him something to maintain. Robert stood 20 feet away, arms crossed, already grinning. Jon held a practice blade scaled to his reach, 5 feet of blunted steel, held at an angle Sir Roderick had spent 3 years arguing him out of, and eventually accepted. He set his weight and watched Jaime's feet and said nothing. Jaime's feet were exceptional. This became clear in the first minute. He controlled distance with the precision of a man who had mapped every opponent's maximum reach and spent his career operating comfortably outside it. The footwork looked simple from the outside, and was not. A step here, a weight transfer there, a lunge at the exact range where the answering swing would arrive a fraction short. He gave Jon a touch on the right shoulder on the third exchange blade landing exactly where Jaime had placed it, and stepped back smiling. Easy. All of it easy. Then Jon stopped retreating. He moved forward without swinging, and Jaime's footwork produced the expected distance, and Jon's stride closed it anyway. Jaime adjusted left, circling, and Jon matched the arc, and somewhere in the next minute of repositioning, Jaime Lannister's expression changed. The smile stayed. The thing behind it did not. Jon's parries were not elegant. They did not need to be. When Jaime's blade came at him, Jon interposed his own with the structural certainty of a man placing a beam across a doorway, not deflection, arrest. The impact traveled back up Jaime's arm and into his elbow with an authority it had never previously met, because no one had ever matched his attacks with that particular combination of mass and angle. Jaime's elbow did not appreciate the education. The circling game that Jaime shifted to in the middle minutes, the geometric slipping game that worked because it made opponents reach, and overextend required opponents to overextend. Jon did not overextend. Jon waited. Jon was, in the way of certain large and patient things, simply present, and while he was present, he was a problem with no clean solution. The blow that ended it came in the final minutes. Jon timed Jaime's lunge, not his own movement, Jaime's, and chose to meet it rather than avoid it, and swung once. The practice blade struck Jaime's pauldron with the sound of a smith's hammer on an anvil, and Jaime Lannister, who had not been lifted off his feet in 20 years of serious training, was lifted fractionally off his feet. He came down clean, because he was too good to fall, but there was a pause. 1 second where he was still, the yard was still, and Jaime recalibrated. Then he stepped back and raised his blade vertical. A salute, not a guard. The yard held its breath. "I have never," Jaime said, his voice carrying without effort, "sparred a man who made me feel slow." The crowd sorted out what it had heard. The finest swordsman in the Seven Kingdoms, offering the only form of respect his vocabulary contained, and offering it to a bastard boy from the north in a practice yard in the middle of winter. The recognition moved through the watching faces like a current. Ned stood at the gate and said nothing. Jon lowered his practice blade and nodded once accepting the salute, without appearing to be particularly moved by it. The migraine had been with him since morning. He had not mentioned it. He was 15 years old and getting practiced at carrying things he had not put down. Ned tried to refuse that evening. He made his case to Robert in his solar after the feast had wound down privately, clearly. With the full authority of a lord in his own hall. Jon was not ready for King's Landing. The South would not see Jon as a person. They would see what he could do, and they would find ways to aim it, and Ned had spent 15 years ensuring that did not happen. Robert listened. He held his cup and he listened, and when Ned had finished, he shook his head. "The South will use what he is," Ned said. "Not who he is." "And is that wrong?" Robert asked. "The realm needs what he is. Men like him left to rot in the North are a waste the gods themselves would answer for." He set down his cup. "He comes south, Ned? That's not a request." Ned looked at Robert for a long time. The fire was low. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when both people in them know which way the decision has already gone. He said yes. He always said yes, when it came to it, and Robert had always known it, and Ned had never found a way to decide how he felt about that. He told Jon that night. Jon stood in the center of his room and received the news in silence, processing, his eyes on the middle distance. Then he asked, "Can I bring ice?" Ned looked at him. Ice was a Valyrian steel greatsword that had belonged to House Stark for 400 years. It was the largest personal weapon in the North. Ned carried it for executions not because it was the practical choice, but because no other blade sent the same message. He had watched Jon hold it once, at 11, and had never forgotten the expression that had crossed his nephew's face when the weight of it settled into his hands. He looked at Jon for a long time. "Yes," he said. Jon nodded and went to find his things. The royal column entered King's Landing through the King's Gate on a morning that smelled of low tide and cookfire smoke, and the particular dense air of a city where 400,000 people live close enough together that the smell of them never quite lifts. Jon rode a destrier, sourced from the Vale, one of 3 horses in the 7 kingdoms, built large enough to carry him without laboring, and he entered the capital of the realm in the way he entered most spaces, quietly, watching, saying nothing. Word had come ahead of them. In King's Landing, word always came ahead. The rumors had moved through the city the way rumors moved through cities embellished at every exchange, stretched by each retelling until they carried the dimensions of legend rather than fact. The small folk who lined the Street of Steel were there to find out whether the legend was true. It was larger. The dockworkers and the merchants and the children who had climbed walls and rooftops and awnings they were not supposed to climb, all of them, went quiet when Jon rode through. The specific quiet of people confronted with something that has not resolved itself into any category their experience has prepared. One woman standing at the edge of the crowd looked up at him as he passed, and then looked at the man beside her and said something, and the man looked up, and whatever he said back she laughed, and the laugh had a slightly hollow quality that said she had not entirely meant to. The court's reaction was different in kind. Cersei Lannister watched from a balcony on the western face of the Red Keep, alone except for a single handmaiden, dressed in green and gold. She watched the column move through the city below. She watched Jon in it. She said nothing to the handmaiden and nothing to anyone else when she went back inside. There was no urgency in her walk. There never was. Littlefinger watched from the shadow of an archway near the castle gate, positioned, as he always was, where watching was possible but presence was deniable. He had the length of ice when he saw it strapped to the horse's flank. He had the width of Jon's shoulders, the height of Jon's reach at rest, the weight estimate of a man who filed things precisely and wasted nothing he filed. His expression during those seconds was the expression of a man updating a ledger. The court received Jon with the particular courtesy the powerful deploy toward things they have not yet classified. He did not help them classify him. He was uncomfortable in southern rooms without possessing the vocabulary to say why, and he managed this by standing chairs at his size were either unavailable or built for a different architecture, and he had determined on the first evening that standing suited him in a court where most conversations happened at shoulder height. He stood at the edges of feast halls and formal introductions and small council antechambers, listening, observing, looking directly at people in a way that the South had decided was rude, and the North had never bothered to decide was anything at all. Joffrey Baratheon was 12 years old and accustomed, in the unexamined way of boys who have never encountered a limit, to being the most visually dominant person in any room he entered. He encountered Jon on the second day in the corridor outside the throne room, and the adjustment required Joffrey looking up instead of across or down, produced in the boy's face an expression that moved through surprise and landed somewhere colder. He said nothing. He found reasons, in the days following, to ensure Jon was not in rooms that Joffrey occupied, and told himself this was preference rather than avoidance. Sansa had come south with Ned's household and was navigating the Red Keep with the disciplined anxiety of someone who has read extensively about a place and is discovering that reading about it and standing inside it are entirely different activities. She found herself, on the third day, standing beside Jon in a doorway, while a reception moved through the hall beyond. And she had not chosen the position deliberately. She had simply drifted, the way people drift toward the one thing in a room that is not performing something. Varys encountered Jon twice in the first week and said very little on both occasions. He watched Jon the way he watched things whose nature had not yet declared itself carefully, and from more than one angle. The Tournament of the Hand was declared on the 5th day after their arrival, in honor of Ned's appointment. 43 knights entered the lists for the jousting. Jon did not. The equipment could not be scaled in the time. Available horses, lances, armor, all of it required modification that weeks could not achieve, and Jon did not argue the point. He entered the melee. The Crown's herald had announced that morning, on Robert's specific instruction, that the melee would be contested with live steel. No one objected. No one was surprised. The melee's rules were simple. Last man standing on the field. He carried ice. The field held 43 men at the opening horn. Within the first 30 seconds, it held 41. 6 knights made the obvious calculation and converged on Jon together. It was the correct tactical conclusion. If one man could not close his reach, 6 men approaching from different angles could overwhelm the geometry. They came at him from the front and both flanks, spreading wide, trying to ensure that engaging one of them forced Jon to expose himself to the others. Jon swung once. Not a thrust, not a targeted strike, a wide horizontal arc that covered a full 140 degrees of the circle around him. At his reach, with ice's length added, the arc's radius was 11 feet. All 6 men were inside 11 feet. The tip moved through its arc at a speed produced by Jon's leverage and the sword's weight combined. And when it reached the 2 knights on his left flank, they took the impact on their raised shields with enough force that one shield arm broke at the elbow, and the other man was knocked off his feet entirely and did not rise. The remaining 4 separated. They did not converge again. Jon settled into the slow pivot that Sir Roderick had spent 3 years calling reckless, and Jon had spent 3 years declining to stop. A constant rotation, steady as a millstone, that ensured no one could approach his blind side while he engaged another direction. On a fighter of ordinary size, it was a desperation move, a man spinning in the center of a shrinking ring, because he had no ground to give. On Jon, at his scale, the geometry transformed it into something else. His pivot radius was larger than most men's entire combat space. He was not a man in the center of a ring. He was the ring, and the ring moved. He did not chase anyone for the next 12 minutes. He did not need to. They came to him eventually, 1 at a time or 2 at a time, in small determined rushes that he absorbed and answered, and the field thinned by degrees, and the crowd in the stands had gone from tournament noise to something quieter and more concentrated. As if the spectacle had shifted registers on them without their noticing. Gregor Clegane entered Jon's awareness from across the field. Not by sight, by sound first, the particular quality of crowd noise that tracked Gregor's movement, a ripple of space that opened ahead of him as other fighters found reasons to be somewhere else. He had dispatched his own cluster of opponents with the businesslike efficiency of a man completing a task that does not require his full attention, and now he stood at the far end of the tournament ground and looked across the field at Jon, and he stopped moving. 8 feet of armored man. The mountain that rides, whose name in King's Landing was shorthand for a category of violence that had no other shorthand. He stood at one end of the field, and Jon stood at the other, and the crowd in the stands registered that the two of them had found each other. And the crowd's noise dropped another register, and kept dropping. Gregor did not attack. He turned away. He found the three remaining fighters on the field, the last men standing besides Jon, and he removed them with the unhurried, systematic attention of someone clearing a table. Not quickly, not brutally, not with the performative viciousness that had characterized his earlier bouts. Efficiently, one, then a second, then a third. He did not look back at Jon while he did it. He did not need to. The field, when he had finished, held two men, and the light above the tournament grounds was going red in the west. They came together in the center. The first exchange was not a sequence of moves. It was a collision. Gregor swung to break, not cut, not thrust, but break, the way a man swings a maul at a gate, the technique of someone for whom the first impact has always been sufficient. The blow came at Jon's pauldron, because the head was too well defended and the pauldron was the widest target, and it landed with a sound the crowd heard 30 rows back. Jon staggered, one step, backward, his left foot finding the ground behind him, and holding. One step. Gregor Clegane stared at him. In 20 years of tournament combat and war and all the violence that preceded and followed both, the mountain had never hit a man with a full blow that produced one step and a recovery. He had watched men airborne. He had watched men unconscious before they reached the ground. He had watched men's shields fold into their arms, and their arms fold wrong. One step and a recovery had never been available as an outcome. He stared at Jon with the expression of a man encountering a result his experience has not prepared him for. Jon raised ice. He raised it in both hands, blade angled across the body, and looked at Gregor across the space between them with the flat gray eyes of a man who has already decided what comes next and is waiting for the interval to conclude, and the crowd in the stands was completely, absolutely silent, not hushed, not murmuring, but silent. The silence of people who have forgotten they came to watch a tournament, because what they are watching is not a tournament. The herald's horn sounded from the tower. 3 long notes. Lights failing. The bout suspended until morning. The crowd exhaled. Some part of the crowd had stopped breathing without knowing it had stopped. And the exhalation moved through the stands like a release of pressure. And then the noise came back, all at once, everyone telling everyone else what they had just seen, and none of them having the right words for it. Jon lowered ice. He looked at Gregor. Gregor looked at him. The two of them stood in the center of the tournament ground in the last of the autumn light and did not look away from each other, and there was nothing in either man's expression that resembled relief. They would finish this tomorrow. They both knew that. What happened inside Gregor Clegane's pavilion on the morning of the resumed bout was not witnessed directly by anyone whose account has survived intact. What the attendants agreed on afterward, in the fragmented way of men who have been frightened and are now being asked to be precise, he dismissed 3 squires before dawn, one of whom left with a broken nose from a collision that may or may not have been deliberate. He did not eat. His arming took the better part of an hour, because fitting 8 feet of man into custom plate required patience and a specific familiarity with his dimensions that his armorer had accumulated over 15 years and no one else in the 7 kingdoms possessed. He did not speak during the arming, not one word to anyone. Sandor Clegane sat outside the pavilion entrance on a camp stool and watched the empty space of the tournament grounds in the early morning gray. He said nothing to anyone either. His face, for those who looked at it, and most people made a habit of not looking at Sandor Clegane's face when they could avoid it, held an expression that was not grief, was not hope, was not anything that mapped cleanly onto a name. He sat until the arming was done, and his brother emerged in full plate. And he stood, and he watched Gregor walk toward the field. Then he sat back down on the stool. He did not follow. Ned found Jon in the Red Keep's godswood an hour before the horn. It was not a large godswood. The Red Keep's garden was a fraction of Winterfell's, a walled enclosure with a weirwood heart tree at its center that the Southerners had never quite known what to do with, which sat in the garden looking faintly misplaced, like something northern that had ended up in the wrong latitude. Jon was sitting beneath it with ice across his knees, eyes closed, breathing with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man doing something specific with the pain behind his eyes. Ned stood at the entrance for a moment before Jon opened his eyes. "It's bad this morning," Ned said. "Yes." "Can you fight?" Jon looked at him. "The headache makes it easier," he said. "Not harder." Ned said nothing. A wind moved through the weirwood's leaves above them. "I know how that sounds," Jon said. "I know you do." Ned looked at his nephew, the boy who was the size of a man's worst concern, sitting in a southern garden with Valyrian steel across his knees and a migraine behind his eyes. Breathing through it with the patience of someone who has been managing it for 8 years, what Jon had said was not a performance of readiness. It was a statement of fact, and Ned knew it was a statement of fact, and standing with that knowledge cost him something he did not have a name for. "Be clean about it," he said finally, "whatever happens out there. Be clean." Jon stood. Ice shifted from his knees to his side in one movement. "I know," he said. Ned walked with him to the field and found nothing else worth saying. The tournament grounds were full by the time they arrived, and the quality of the crowd's presence had changed from every previous morning of the hands tourney. No one was eating. No one was talking in the distracted, half-attending way of tournament crowds. The stands held every person who could claim a seat. The walls beyond the stands held everyone who could not small folk on rooftops and awnings that were not built for small folk, vendors who had abandoned their carts, children in positions that would alarm their parents when their parents thought about it later. The whole city had turned out, because the whole city had spent the night discussing what they had watched on that field yesterday evening before the herald's horn ended it. Cersei Lannister sat in the royal box with her hands folded. Robert sat beside her with a cup he was not drinking from. Littlefinger occupied the row behind the royal box with the stillness of a man who has made a wager and is now waiting for the count. The small council was present. Half the lords of the 7 kingdoms who had come to King's Landing for the tournament were present. Everyone understood, without having been told, that this was no longer about the tournament. Gregor entered from the far end of the field without ceremony. He was already armed, already helmed, the greatsword held loosely at his right side. He walked to the center with the unhurried mass of something that has never needed to announce itself, and he stopped, and he waited. Jon was already there. The herald spoke the formal opening. No one listened to it. Then the herald stepped back. Gregor came fast, faster than he should have moved in 8 feet of plate armor, and this had always been the true terror of him, not the size, which was visible and could be accounted for, but the acceleration the size concealed. He covered the ground between them in 3 strides and brought the greatsword across in a horizontal swing at Jon's shield. And it connected with the sound of timber splitting under a maul. The shield lasted 1 impact. Jon felt the blow travel from the board through his left arm and understood what a second such impact would produce. He released the shield before it could disagree with the decision. It hit the dirt, split down its center seam and shifted ice into both hands and reset his feet. The shield had been the wrong instrument, built for men whose arms are the longest thing about them, consuming a hand Jon needed to manage ice's weight and angle. Without it, he had nothing but reach. With ice in both hands, reach was sufficient. They met in the center of the field for the next several minutes, and the exchanges were unlike anything the tournament ground had hosted. Because neither man was managing the other, both were applying everything they had and finding it matched. Gregor pressed. Jon managed distance, using ice's length to hold Gregor at the boundary where the greatsword could reach Jon, but Gregor's hands could not. Each swing from Gregor arrived with the momentum of a trebuchet arm, and Jon's parries did not deflect them so much as absorb them, redirecting mass rather than opposing it, his feet moving to bleed the force sideways rather than catch it full. The migraine crested somewhere in the 4th minute. It came the way it always came at its worst, a sudden escalation, a band of pressure across the base of his skull that reduced the world to a narrow aperture. The crowd noise dropped away. The peripheral light contracted. What remained in the aperture was this: the geometry of where Gregor stood, the angle of ice's next movement, the tell in Gregor's right shoulder that arrived 2 beats before each swing committed. The pain was immense. The pain was also, exactly as Jon had told Ned and meant without qualification, not a disadvantage. The world simplified. The uncertainty simplified. There was nothing in the aperture for anything except the calculation, and the calculation was clear. He began to take ground. Not quickly, not obviously, but by degree the distance management tightening, the parries arriving fractionally earlier, the positioning improving in small increments that added up. Gregor adapted, as capable men do. He changed the angle of his attacks, compressed the circle of his footwork, tried to reduce the space where ice's length was the decisive variable. Jon matched each adjustment because the migraine had stripped away everything except the mathematics of the exchange, and the mathematics were visible to him at the bottom of the pain the way they were never quite visible otherwise. 3/4 through the fight, Gregor made his decision. He drove forward into a grapple going for Jon's body, trying to get inside the reach and bring his wrestling strength to bear. Against any other opponent in the Seven Kingdoms, this was the correct decision. Inside the reach, with his hands on a man's frame, Gregor's wrestling strength had ended fights in ways the winners afterward declined to describe in detail. Against Jon, it meant Gregor had walked inside Jon's reach. Jon's left hand released Ice's grip. Not dropped released, controlled. His right hand kept the sword, managed it, while his left arm came up and across, and the elbow drove into the left side of Gregor Clegane's jaw, with the full rotational torque of Jon's frame behind it. Every pound of him, through the lever of the arm, focused into one point of impact. Gregor's head moved sideways. He staggered. The sound from the crowd was not a cheer. It was an inhale, one collective intake from thousands of people simultaneously. The sound of a mass of human beings experiencing something that has altered their understanding of what is possible. Gregor Clegane had not staggered in his adult life. Every person present had known this the way people know the properties of large permanent things. And now the large permanent thing had moved, and something in the crowd's shared sense of the world was adjusting to accommodate it. Gregor found his footing. He turned back. Jon raised Ice. He had been raised in the north, by a man who had told him once that the thing done halfway was a thing done wrong, and the principle had been repeated until it had become structural. He raised Ice in both hands above his right shoulder, at the angle Sir Roderick had taught him years ago, and Gregor was still finding his balance, his head still processing what the elbow had done to it. It was not a triumphant swing. It was not a swing performed for the crowd, or for Robert, or for history. It was a clean, precise, terminal movement that removed Gregor Clegane's head in front of the King of the Seven Kingdoms, the small council of the Seven Kingdoms, the assembled lords of the Seven Kingdoms, and every person in King's Landing who had climbed something they should not have climbed to see it, and the city would carry the memory of it for the rest of its life. The body took a moment to understand. Then it fell. Jon stood. He was barely breathing hard. He looked up at the royal box. Cersei Lannister's face, in the seconds after, told everything it was capable of telling, which was very little. She was not grieving. She had no grief for Gregor Clegane, no warmth, no attachment, nothing resembling personal feeling. What she had was 15 years of practical reliance, the certainty that a physical answer to any physical problem existed, that its name was Gregor, and that it could be directed. The answer was now a head in the tournament sand and a body bleeding out beside it, and the man who had produced this outcome was 15 years old, and standing in the center of the field, looking up at her with the flat gray eyes of someone who has settled a matter rather than won a glory. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and whatever reorganization was occurring behind her face did not show there. Robert was bellowing something beside her. The crowd below had erupted. She heard none of it in any useful sense. She was thinking about her father. Tywin Lannister was at Casterly Rock when the Raven arrived. The message reached him 2 days after the bout, in the late afternoon, delivered by an aide who understood enough about his lord's temperament to hand the letter over and step back without speaking. Tywin read it once. He read it a second time, more slowly, as though a more careful reading might clarify something the first had left ambiguous. He refolded the paper with the methodical precision of a man who keeps his hands occupied because the alternative would be noticeable. He set it on the table. He said nothing for a very long time. The aide who had brought the Raven, standing at the entrance with the professional stillness of a man who knows when to remain invisible, counted the silence and afterward could not say how long it lasted. Long enough that the fire in the brazier shifted and resettled. Long enough that the camp sounds outside grew audible in the absence of Tywin's voice. When Tywin finally spoke, he asked for his maps. The 2 weeks after the Mountain's death established a pattern that King's Landing spent some time deciding what to call. Jon was in rooms he had no formal right to occupy, because Ned, as Hand of the King, moved through those rooms, and Jon moved with him. Small council antechambers, the corridors between the Tower of the Hand and the throne room, the outer hall where petitioners waited with their cases. Jon stood in corners and said nothing. He stood near doorways and said nothing. He listened, with the background hum of the headache always present. At the low register he had stopped noticing the way men stop noticing the cold. And he listened to everything. The court found this more unsettling than the fighting had been. The fighting was comprehensible. A man of extraordinary size, doing extraordinary violence, had precedence, however distant. A man of extraordinary size standing quietly in the corner of a room, where powerful people discussed the management of the realm, listening with no apparent agenda, was harder to file. They had expected the physical dominance to come attached to a particular kind of mind. Loud, manageable, limited to its own domain. They were revising. He was northern. He was very good at silence. In King's Landing, these turned out to be far more useful than anyone, including Jon, had anticipated. The Master of Coin delivered his quarterly account to the small council on a gray morning 11 days after the tournament. Jon was in the antechamber with the door ajar present because Ned had asked him to wait there, excluded from the chamber itself because Littlefinger had observed. At the session's opening, that bastards holding no official position perhaps belonged in the anteroom, and Robert had glanced at Jon and shrugged in the way Robert shrugged at things he was not prepared to argue about at that hour. Jon sat on a bench too small for him and listened through the gap in the door. The debt accounting took an hour. He followed most of it. He was not a numbers man and had never claimed to be, but Ned Stark had raised him to distrust things that resolved too smoothly, and Littlefinger's numbers resolved very smoothly. Each figure was round or near round, each debt accounted for in a manner that had the surface of something prepared for the purpose of being received rather than examined. What stopped him was the Lannister figure. The Crown's outstanding obligation to House Lannister interest-bearing loans, extended at the start of Robert's reign to fund the transition of power, was cited by Littlefinger at 42,000 gold dragons. The number was delivered with the same even confidence as every other number, and the small council received it with the same even attention. 3 days before that session, Jon had been standing in a corridor in the lower keep at a height that people did not account for when choosing where to have private conversations, because people did not look up, and Jon's head was always near the ceiling, while 2 men spoke quietly near a window below him. One was a Lannister lord visiting the capital, speaking to a companion about correspondence from Casterly Rock. He cited a number. The number he cited for the Crown's Lannister obligation was 61,000 gold dragons. He cited it twice, because his companion had not heard the first time. Jon had not known, standing in that corridor, why the number would matter. In the antechamber, with Littlefinger's voice coming through the gap in the door, he understood. He said nothing. Not in the anteroom, not in the corridors afterward, not that evening. He thought about it for 2 days. He thought about what the gap between 42 and 61,000 gold dragons represented, and where it could possibly be going. And the only answer that resolved the discrepancy without requiring coincidence was the answer he brought to the small anteroom attached to the Master of Coin's offices, where Littlefinger sat alone between appointments with a cup of wine and a stack of correspondence. The room was small, writing table, 2 chairs, a window too narrow for anything except light. Jon stepped through the door and his shoulders had 6 inches from the walls on either side. The door behind him was still technically open. It was not, in any useful sense, an exit. Littlefinger looked up. He smiled. It was not a social reflex, it was a deliberate production that reached his eyes because he had practiced it to reach his eyes. And it had the quality of something that had been prepared in the quarter second between recognizing Jon and responding to him. "Jon Snow," he said, "this is unexpected. How can the Master of Coin be of service?" "You reported the Lannister debt at 42,000 gold dragons," Jon said, a brief adjustment behind the smile. "That is correct." 3 days before your report, I overheard Lord Daemon Lannister tell his companion that the crown owes his house 61,000 gold dragons. He was reading from a letter. He read the number twice. Lord Daemon is not the master of coin. The tone was patient, professorial, the tone of a man explaining an obvious thing to someone who cannot quite be expected to understand it. He would be working from Casterly Rock's own records, which may well include interest, Jon said. You reported the principal. Is that what I'm hearing? It is a standard accounting convention to separate. Is the crown obligated to pay 61,000 gold dragons to House Lannister, or 42? The room held the question. Littlefinger set his cup down. Something behind his face was working, not visible on the surface, but present the way current is present beneath still water. There are different conventions for how interest obligations are structured in instruments of this. Is the crown obligated to pay 61,000 gold dragons to House Lannister, or 42? He had not raised his voice. He had not moved. He simply said the same thing again, in the same register, and waited. A pause long enough to mean something. You're going to tell your father, Littlefinger said. And then Robert. I'm going to tell my father what I heard in the corridor and what you told the small council. Before I do that, I want your explanation. If the explanation is sufficient, I won't need to say any. Littlefinger looked at him. Jon watched the assessment happening, the recalibration, the options being closed and opened and closed again. Then, Littlefinger spread his hands on the table in a gesture of openness that was as constructed as everything else about him, and his voice shifted to the register it used for offers. There are other arrangements that might resolve this more usefully for everyone involved. Financial instruments. Positions of some distinction that your father, as hand, is well placed to. Jon said nothing. He went still. Not the stillness of a man holding himself back, simply the stillness of a man who has stopped engaging, because engagement has stopped being the relevant question. He stood in the small room and looked at Littlefinger with the flat gray eyes that did not blink any more often than necessary, and did not carry any of the things Littlefinger had expected them to carry: appetite, ambition, calculation, negotiability. Littlefinger looked at Jon's face. He looked at the door. He looked at Jon's face again. He confessed. Carefully, precisely, in the manner of a man who understands that the quality of a confession shapes its aftermath, framing it as a long-standing advisory arrangement, a facilitation fee embedded in the interest schedule across 5 years of debt management. A mechanism not without precedent in the financial history of the Free Cities, where such arrangements were common practice and perfectly stop, Jon said. Littlefinger stopped. Jon said, "Come with me." Ned was in the Tower of the Hand when they arrived. Robert was summoned and came annoyed, and became something other than annoyed as the shape of the situation assembled itself around him. The small council gathered with the energy of people who understand that something has broken through the normal surface of proceedings. Varys, Pycelle, Renly Baratheon, new to his seat at the council's far end. Joffrey, who had heard that something was happening in the council chamber and had arranged to be present before anyone could arrange otherwise. Jon delivered his account in the order it had occurred to him: the corridor, the number, the report, the discrepancy, the conversation in the anteroom. He was not a practiced speaker. He stated facts in sequence and allowed them to exist. Littlefinger delivered his version. It was technically defensible in the specific way that a structure built from the right materials in the wrong configuration is technically still a structure. The interest as arrangement framing held together if none of the load-bearing points were examined directly. Jon told the room why they did not hold together. He cited the figure Lord Daemon had read twice from a Casterly Rock letter. He noted that the interest schedule Littlefinger described would not produce a gap of 19,000 gold dragons unless a portion of the obligation had been routed somewhere other than the Lannister vaults. He said this without raising his voice or consulting notes, because he had no notes, because the numbers had arranged themselves in his head with the same clarity that combat geometry arranged itself when the migraine was at its peak, and they had not rearranged since. The room was quiet. Robert looked at Littlefinger. Robert looked at Jon. He looked at Ned, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into the expression he used when he had already answered the question internally, and was waiting for the room to reach him. "What does the law say?" Robert asked. "A lord who steals from the crown," Ned said, "can be put to death." Robert was quiet for a moment. He looked at Littlefinger one final time, and whatever he was looking for was not there. "That seems right," he said. What followed happened in the small council chamber with ice, and the accounts written afterward did not describe it in detail. The people who wrote the accounts had been in the room and understood that some specifics did not improve with repetition. What they noted were the faces. Varys closed his eyes, a single deliberate closing, held for one breath, then open. He had spent 30 years aware that Littlefinger was simultaneously indispensable and the most corrosive element in the realm's political architecture, had managed around him, had worked with him, had never been able to remove him without becoming the thing he was trying to remove. The expression when he opened his eyes was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was the expression of a man setting down something very heavy that he had been holding for a very long time. Grand Maester Pycelle gripped the edge of the table with both hands and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man whose understanding of the possible has been revised without his permission, and who is performing the uncomfortable arithmetic of updating it. Joffrey was smiling. Not the court smile, a real one, unguarded, lit from somewhere behind the eyes. He had never looked more alive in his 12 years. He had never looked more precisely like what he was. A bastard had just executed the man who managed the realm's finances, with a Valyrian steel sword, in the small council chamber, in front of the king and the assembled council, and Joffrey's delight was total and unexamined. It was, by a considerable distance, worse than horror would have been. Jon looked at the room when it was done. He looked at each face in sequence, and he looked at Joffrey last, and longest. He said nothing. He walked to the door. He did not look back. The boar that charged from the tree line on the 4th hour of the hunt was large enough that its approach flattened the undergrowth ahead of it like a prow displacing water. It came at Robert Baratheon's horse with the speed of something that has already decided and is only executing the decision, and it came from the left, from the direction the undergrowth was thickest. From the direction no one had been watching, because the deer had been running right. Robert was on his 3rd skin of Arbor Gold. He was half dismounted from a horse that had chosen the wrong moment to spook at a snapped branch, one boot still in the stirrup, the wineskin and his coordination working against each other, and the boar's first tusk caught the horse's flank, and the horse screamed and went down, and Robert went with it into the undergrowth. 250 pounds of king attack and momentum going sideways into the leaf rot, with the horse collapsing on his right side. The boar turned. They always turned. Jon was already moving. His horse covered the 15 feet between them in 2 strides, and Jon came out of the saddle while the horse was still moving, hit the ground, got a hand under Robert's arm. Pulled, and the boar's second charge arrived while Jon was between it and Robert, and the left tusk caught him across the outside of his left thigh and opened a wound 8 inches long through the leather and the muscle beneath it. He did not go down. He stepped sideways, dragging Robert with him, and 2 of the king's guards arrived with spears. And the boar died within the next 30 seconds in the way boars die when enough steel finds them loudly, and without grace. Robert sat up in the leaves. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his right arm was wrenched at the shoulder, and his horse was dying 3 feet away. He looked at Jon. Jon was bleeding steadily through his left trouser leg. The wound was deep but not vital. The muscle the tusk had passed through was, on a man of Jon's density, 6 inches thick before it reached anything that mattered. He had lost blood. He had not lost the leg. The wound required a maester's attention and 40 minutes of sitting still while the stitching was done, and Jon sat for it with the patience of someone accustomed to managing several unpleasant physical sensations simultaneously, the headache at its low familiar frequency running beneath the stitching the way it always ran beneath everything. "That," Robert said, still sitting in the leaves with his arm wrenched and the smell of blood and rot around him, "was extremely close." "Yes," Jon said. Robert looked at him. Then he began to laugh, the full, unguarded sound of a man who has just been within reach of death and has come back from it, and finds the coming back to be the funniest thing he has encountered in years. Jon helped him up. They walked back to the horses. Robert was confined to the Red Keep for 3 weeks. The gash along his ribs from the first tusk required a maester's attention twice daily. His wrenched arm was bound. The maesters had made their position on wine in quantity sufficiently clear that he was not quite willing to ignore them, while his side stitched itself closed, which meant he was, for the first time in years, unable to drink himself past reflection. He lay in his recovery chamber and was still, which Robert Baratheon was not accustomed to being, and in the stillness he thought, which he was equally unaccustomed to, and what he thought about, among other things, was Jon. On the 18th day, he sent word for Ned. Ned went to the Red Keep's godswood in the hour before he went to Robert's chamber. He sat beneath the weirwood with his hands on his knees and looked at the carved face bleeding its slow red sap into the roots. The Red Keep's weirwood was smaller than Winterfell's, further from whatever made the northern trees feel attended, but it served the same purpose. He had carried this secret for 15 years with the discipline of a man who has decided that the weight is simply the condition and not a thing to be managed. He had stopped noticing it the way he had stopped noticing certain other permanent things. He was about to set it down. He did not know what walking without it would feel like. He stood. He went to Robert's chamber. Tywin Lannister received Cersei's raven and subsequently every piece of intelligence his network had assembled about Jon Snow over the preceding months. He spent 3 days with these reports before his generals, and he was not afraid of what they described. Because Tywin Lannister was not afraid of single variables. Single variables were things you adjusted to. He adjusted. The adjustment had 2 components. The first was military. Jon Snow was a battlefield asset of a kind that existing doctrine had not accounted for, which meant existing doctrine required modification before Lannister forces engaged him. The second was temporal. Jon must be engaged before he reached Dragonstone. Tywin's intelligence from the island was incomplete fragments from household servants, second-hand accounts from sailors who had anchored in Dragonstone's harbor and noted unusual activity near the Dragonmont, but the fragments had a direction. A Targaryen heir, now formally acknowledged by royal decree, entering the realm's record. Volcanic tunnels that the island's garrison had been ordered to leave undisturbed. The intersection of these 2 facts produced a conclusion Tywin could not afford to ignore. A man of Jon's physical capacity was a problem. A man of Jon's physical capacity on a dragon was a different category of problem entirely, and Tywin Lannister had built his life on addressing problems before they changed categories. He deployed his forces toward the Reach border without formal declaration. Formal declarations were instruments of men who lacked the nerve to let their army speak for them. The royal army marched west from King's Landing in early spring, and Jon spent the evenings in Robb's tent with Robb and Lord Randall Tarly, who had come to the royal cause with the manner of a man who has examined the mathematics of the situation and found his answer there rather than in loyalty. Tarly did not like Jon. He found Jon's dimensions an affront to military proportion in the way that rigid professional minds find anything that departs from established doctrine aesthetically wrong. But he answered Jon's questions, because Jon's questions were specific, and specificity was a quality Tarly respected regardless of its source. Why are the charge distances set at 980 yards? Jon asked one evening, over maps. Tarly explained the calculation. Maximum crossbow effective range was 60 yards. 90 yards gave cavalry enough distance to build momentum before the volley, and enough horse length to absorb casualties without losing formation cohesion before contact with the line. That assumes the enemy's maximum engagement range at the point of contact is fixed, Jon said. A mounted knight at contact has 8 feet of reach with lance or sword. The infantry line is built to manage 8 feet. Jon ran one finger along the scale of the map. My reach with ice from horseback is 17 feet. The shield wall assumes a threat arriving at one height. I arrive at a different height. He looked up. I don't fit the calculation. Tarly was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at the map with the expression of a man updating a model he has relied on for 30 years. No, he said, you don't. The Lannister commanders met the night before the battle in a pavilion on a low rise above the Gold Road, with torches and maps and the professional anxiety of men who have been handed an unusual problem and understand that unusual problems require unusual solutions. Their conclusion was correct. Ranged fire on the giant before he closed distance was the priority. 3 crossbow companies positioned in the line's elevated second rank, with a clean angle across the open ground Jon would have to cross to reach the shield wall. The moment he spurred, they would fire. It was the right answer. It was not enough. The royal vanguard assembled on the Gold Road at first light infantry forward, cavalry behind. Jon at the center on his veiled destrier, with ice across his saddle. The Lannister line stretched 300 yards across the road and into the fields on either side, shield wall forward, crossbow companies elevated in the second rank, precisely as his scouts had reported. Jon studied the line for 10 minutes. He identified the 3 crossbow companies by the angle of their positions and the spacing of their standards. He measured the ground between his position and the wall with his eyes, the way Tarly had shown him, and translated distance into seconds, and translated seconds into reload time, and found his window. He turned to the infantry captain and gave the order. The infantry advanced under locked shields, slow, absorbing the ground in the way a formation is built to absorb ground when it expects to be hit. The Lannister crossbowmen fired at 50 yards optimal range, maximum penetration, and bolts found gaps, and men fell, and the formation held and kept moving. The crossbowmen began to reload. Jon spurred. His horse covered 90 yards in 8 seconds. A ranked crossbow company needed 12 to reload, re-aim, and fire with accuracy. He had calculated this. He had watched Tarly's crossbowmen reload every morning for a week and counted the seconds. The crossbowmen were still cranking when he hit the wall. It did not bend. It folded. His horse's weight and momentum combined with his own at the seam between the 3rd and 4th companies, where 2 formations met and their connection was thinnest, and the wall came apart at that seam in a single compressive failure, men going backward, men going sideways, the structure not grinding down under sustained force, but breaking in the immediate total way that structures break, when something has found the exact point their tolerance cannot absorb. The gap opened in the space of 4 strides, and the cavalry came through it at his back, and the Lannister center was not a line anymore. The fighting inside the broken line was close and dense and wrong for cavalry in the conventional sense, and Jon used this correctly. He kept his horse but abandoned momentum standing in the stirrups at his full height. Ice moving in horizontal arcs that arrived at a level the infantry's shields had not been built to address. Shields were constructed to manage threats arriving at chest height and below. Jon's reach from the saddle arrived at the height of a man's head, above the rim of the shield. From above the angle the formation was braced to resist. A swing that landed correctly did not need to kill the man it struck. It needed to displace him from his position in the formation, which opened a gap, which put the men on his sides under stress they had not expected, which the cavalry behind Jon could exploit before the unit reformed. He was not fighting men. He was fighting formations, the geometry of them. The structural arrangement of bodies that gave an infantry line its integrity. He moved through the Lannister center the way a crack moves through stone, not by raw force alone, but by finding the places where the structure was already under tension and providing the precise increment that exceeded what the tension could hold. The line broke in 3 places. Then, in 5. Then, it was no longer a line. Tywin's retreat was clean. The army of a man who prepares for failure as rigorously as he prepares for success retreats, with the discipline of a force that has been given precise instructions for exactly this outcome. The Lannister rearguard held. The main body disengaged. The rout did not become a massacre. By midday, the Lannister forces were moving west toward the hills at the pace of a managed withdrawal rather than a broken flight, and Tywin's personal guard was already riding ahead to Casterly Rock to ensure the gates were staffed and the war councils were assembled for the evening. The accounts written afterward by men who had been on that field agreed on the same primary detail. The Lannisters broke when Jon Snow rode into their center. Not when the cavalry flanked, not when the infantry pushed, when Jon hit the wall. He sat on his horse at the center of the field as the surgeons began their work at the edges, looking west toward the hills that hid Casterly Rock from view. Ice lay across his saddle, still dark from the morning's use. Around him the field was doing what fields did after the fighting stopped producing its particular sounds and smells, the work of triage and counting, and the slow administrative grief of tallying what the day had cost. He had a headache. He always had a headache after a battle. The full familiar register returning as the clarity burned off, and the ordinary world came back with all its noise. He did not mind. The pain meant the clarity had been present when the clarity was needed. He looked west for a long time. Then he turned his horse toward the camp and the work that came after. The island was visible for an hour before the fleet reached it. It rose from the narrow sea, in the manner of something built from below rather than above volcanic rock, black and fissured, the castle on its crown of twisted spires that looked grown from the stone rather than placed on it. The Targaryens had held this island before the conquest and after it, and the castle looked like what it was, a remnant of another age of the world that had not quite finished being absorbed by this one. There were no gentle approaches to Dragonstone. The cliffs dropped directly into the sea. The harbor was carved from rock rather than built into it. Even the light above the island looked different from the light above the rest of the narrow sea, flatter, older, as though the volcanic heat rising from the Dragonmont bent it somehow. Jon stood at the prow of the flagship and watched it come. His headache had changed. Not worsened, the pain was at a familiar moderate register, perhaps slightly elevated by the sea's motion. The change was in its character. The background noise that had been undifferentiated pressure for 8 years had acquired direction. It was pulling toward the island the way a compass needle pulls north, not dragging him, not compelling him, but oriented. He had felt the island before the fleet crested the horizon. He had felt it before the watch called the sighting from the mast. He said nothing to Ned. Ned was 20 feet behind him, speaking with the fleet commander, and Jon crouched at the base of the foremast, where Ghost was lying, and placed his hand on the direwolf's flank. In the way he had always communicated with Ghost, not words, never words, a direction of feeling rather than anything language could carry, he showed Ghost what he was feeling. The pull. The changed quality of the pain. Ghost lifted his head and looked toward the island, and his red eyes held it for a long time. They anchored in the harbor at midday. Ned and the commanders went to the great hall. Jon went to the outer walls. The Dragonmont was taller from its base than it appeared from the sea. Its sides were dense and dark, the rock cooling from whatever ancient event had formed it, and the tunnels the Targaryen dragonlords had carved into it over 3 centuries of habitation were sealed now, their entrances blocked by falls of stone and decades of neglect. The garrison had been instructed to leave the tunnels undisturbed. None of them had asked why. None had particularly wanted to know. Standing on the battlement above the harbor, Jon's headache pulled toward the mountain with the steadiness of a lodestone pulling iron. He went in the night. After the second watch, in full dark, without telling anyone. He took a torch from the wall outside his chamber and left ice on his bed the passages, his instinct said. Were going to be too narrow for anything he could not carry close to his body, and walked down from the castle toward the Dragonmont with the torch in one hand and the mountain's pull running through his skull like a cord. The first entrance was a low archway cut by hands that had known larger spaces. He turned sideways to fit through it. The smell arrived immediately, sulfur first, and beneath it something older and less nameable, the heat of deep earth, the smell of stone that has been hot longer than men have existed to smell stone. The walls were warm under his hand, not unpleasantly, the warmth of something that had been retaining heat for centuries without release. He moved inward and downward through passages that branched. At each branch he followed what the pull indicated, the way a man follows a sound toward its source, without deliberating. The torch showed him 10 feet in every direction and nothing beyond. The silence was the silence of deep enclosed rock, not the absence of sound, but its physical suppression, as though the stone consumed vibration rather than reflecting it. The migraine was at its maximum by the time he reached the deep chamber, not the blinding peak that sometimes took his vision on one side. Maximum frequency, both signals running simultaneously at their highest register. The warg sense reaching outward for living things, and the dragon sense reaching for something that had not existed in the world within living memory, the two of them colliding in the space behind his eyes the way they had collided every day of his life, producing the specific pain of 2 things trying to occupy the same space. He walked to the center of the chamber and held the torch out. The torchlight did not reach the far wall. It traveled the distance it should have traveled and stopped not at a wall, not at any surface he could identify, but simply stopped, as though what lay beyond was not reflective, but absorptive. The parts of the cavern where the light failed were darker than the surrounding rock, not merely unlit darker, as if light chose not to enter the spaces those parts occupied. Jon extended the torch at arm's length and gained 3 feet and stood still, and let his eyes resolve what the light was willing to show him. A scale, the size of a cartwheel, curved, black with the particular quality of black that was not a color, but the absence of one, not charcoal, not ink, not any shade he had seen before, but a quality of darkness that seemed to pull more darkness toward it. A claw, partially visible, resting on the cavern floor, the length of a sword. The shape of an eye, closed, the size of a shield, in the deepest part of the darkness. Jon had his mouth open. He did not know what he would have said. The eye opened before he spoke. It opened the way a door opens when someone is already on the other side with prior knowledge, with the movement being a response rather than a reaction. Not startled by the torchlight, not triggered by his footstep or his breath. Opened because the thing behind it had been aware of him for longer than he had been aware of it, and had decided the interval between awareness and acknowledgement was concluded. The iris was red, not the red of fire, not the red of blood, the red of old coals that have been banked for a very long time and retain their heat without producing light. The red of something that has been waiting and is done waiting. The pain resolved, not stopped resolved, the way a discord resolves when the missing note is finally sounded. The 2 signals that had been colliding in Jon's skull for 8 years, the warg sense reaching for living things, the dragon sense reaching for a creature that had not existed in the world within living memory, recognized each other across the torchlit air between Jon and the oldest surviving dragon in the world. The channel completed. The cacophony became a signal. The signals were no longer 2 things colliding, but one thing finding its direction, and the direction was quiet. Jon had never known his pain as anything other than collision. Not once in 15 years. He had managed it, learned to work through it, built his understanding of himself around its constant presence the way men build their understanding of weather around rain. He stood in the deep chamber beneath Dragonstone and felt the collision cease, not the pain gone, not the signals extinguished, but the war between them ending, finding their common purpose, the channel completing, and the noise settling into something he could hear rather than suffer. It was the most profound silence he had ever experienced, and it was happening inside his own skull. And it was the closest thing to stillness he had ever known. He breathed. He looked at the red eye looking back at him, and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he was both halves of his inheritance meeting in this chamber, where the oldest living dragon in the world had been in the dark for 160 years, waiting for blood it recognized. He stood for a long time. The torch burned. The red eye did not close. What followed was not graceful. The cannibal's emergence from the Dragonmont was not a spectacle prepared for an audience. It was a natural event, a large geological process occurring in compressed time. The island shook, not trembled, shook, with the specific frequency of bedrock absorbing something it was not built to contain. The harbor churned. The fleet at anchor rose and dropped on water that had no business moving in the absence of wind, and the chains on the anchors went taut against forces they were not designed to resist, and every soldier and sailor on the island woke in the same moment to the understanding that the ground beneath them was wrong, and the sea was wrong, and the Dragonmont was producing a sound that had no name in. The vocabulary of natural disasters. Then the cannibal was in the sky. The fleet's sailors, professional men who had seen weather and battles and the various emergencies the sea produces, experienced approximately 90 seconds of pure animal terror before the cognitive part of their minds reasserted and told them what they were looking at. By the time the reassertion completed, the shape above the island was already half a mile out over the narrow sea and still climbing, and the shape on its back small relative to the animal, proportional in the way a rider is proportional on a very large horse, had not fallen. Jon held on. That was the sum of his contribution to the first flight. He held on. The cannibal went where the cannibal willed, which was out over the sea at speed, then south, then into a banking turn that pulled Jon's weight against his grip with a force he had not anticipated and could not fully resist, and then upward, through the cold layer of cloud, into the air above the clouds where the stars were visible in a way they were never visible from the ground, clear, enormous. The full sky with no horizon to limit it. Jon held on and kept his eyes open because closing them was worse, and breathed through the cold that the altitude produced, and learned. Communication came by degrees. Not commands, not words through the channel the migraine's resolution had opened, the quiet bond where the warg sense and dragon sense now ran together in the space behind his eyes that had always been occupied by the collision's noise. A direction of feeling rather than direction of language. Not different, he recognized slowly, from how he had always communicated with Ghost. They came back at dawn from the sea, the sun rising at their backs, Dragonstone dark ahead of them in the last of the night. Ned was on the battlements. He had been there since the island shook. Jon learned afterward had gone to the walls when the ground moved, and seen the shape rising from the Dragonmont, and had stayed, through the dark and the cold. Watching the harbor's disturbed water settle, and the shape's absence in the sky above the sea. He stood with his hands behind his back in the posture Jon had known his entire life as his thinking posture, and he watched Jon descend on the cannibal's back toward the lower courtyard as the sun came up behind both of them. Ned did not feel relief. He examined what he felt, standing on those battlements in the early cold, and it was not relief required the possibility that the outcome might have been otherwise, and Ned could not honestly say he had believed that possibility. What he felt was correctness, the sense of a world that has arranged itself, after long patience, into the shape it was always going to make. The sense of a man who has carried a secret long enough to see the secret find its purpose, and who has survived long enough to witness it, and who has nothing left to do now but stand on a battlement in the cold and acknowledge that the thing he protected has become the thing it was. Jon climbed down from the cannibal's back in the courtyard below, and stood on the stone and looked up at Ned on the battlements. His hands were bleeding at the knuckles from the holding. His face was scraped by the high-altitude wind. He looked up, and his face held something Ned had never seen in it before, the specific quality of a face that is not at war with itself, that is simply present. That has found the register it was always meant to run at. Ned stood on the battlements and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying that the morning had not already said. Casterly Rock had not been built. This was the first thing to understand about it, and the thing that visitors consistently failed to understand, which was why their sieges consistently failed. Over 8,000 years the Lannister kings of the western coast had done to the promontory above the Sunset Sea what water does to stone over geological time, found its weaknesses, its hollow places, its natural fault lines and chambers, and worked with these rather than against them, shaping the rock into a fortification whose walls were not walls at all, but the original stone of the mountain itself, dressed and fitted with gates of iron and oak embedded in the cliff face, the way teeth are embedded in bone. Its water supply was internal springs fed by the geological formation that made the promontory defensible in the first place. Its food stores, at full supply, could sustain a garrison for years without resupply. No siege engine in the Seven Kingdoms had the geometry to breach its outer gates. Mining was impossible because the walls were the mountain. Starvation took years. 8,000 years of enemies had attempted each of these approaches, and 8,000 years of Lannisters had waited them out. Tywin Lannister stood on the battlements in the hour before dawn and watched the royal forces arrange themselves on the ground below, and his expression was not the expression of a man who is afraid. Contempt was an emotion Tywin reserved for opponents who had already lost the capacity to harm him. The thing approaching his gates had not lost that capacity. He assessed it with the attention of a professional, and his professional assessment was, "This is a problem of a kind I have not encountered before." The cannibal rose over the headland from the sea at first light. It circled the rock once, close enough that every man on the walls could understand what was above him. The heat that preceded it was not weather. The shadow it cast over the outer courtyard was not cloud. The sound it made was not a roar. It was lower than a roar, structural, the sound of something very large moving through air, not built for something that large. The soldiers on the walls watched it complete its circuit, and the ones who prayed prayed, and the ones who did not stood very still, and waited for whatever came next. The raven arrived within the hour. The message was 2 sentences, written in a hand that was large and even and without decoration. Surrender Casterly Rock, and every life within it is spared. Fight, and I will have no reason to hold the dragon back." Tywin read it twice. He folded it and gave it back to the maester and walked to his solar and called his advisors. He did not surrender. He did not order his forces to fight. He raised a flag of parley. The negotiations ran for 3 days, under the specific terms of parley that both sides agreed to observe, and during those 3 days, the civilian population of Casterly Rock, the servants, the household staff, the craftsmen, the non-combatant members of the Lannister family, the women and children of the garrison were moved systematically out of the rock and into the secondary keeps and villages of the Westerlands that the Lannister name could still command. Along with them went documents. Gold, records, the full category of movable assets that distinguish a family's wealth from a castle's walls. Robb, riding with the royal forces on the ground below the rock, watched the steady procession of carts and people emerging from the rock's lower gates over the 3 days of parley, and brought his observation to Jon. "He's using the evacuation," Robb said. "You gave him 3 days to move his people, and he's using 3 days to move everything else." "I know," Jon said. "The gold from the rock alone. I know what he's moving." Jon was looking at the rock above them against the winter sky. "He's doing it because I told him I'd spare every life in the rock, and he's decided a life is a broad enough category to include his household accounts." Robb studied him. "And you're letting him." "I said I would spare every life in the rock, and I meant it when I said it, and the realm will hear that I meant it." Jon watched the procession below. "Tywin Lannister moving his gold is a fair price for the realm knowing I say what I mean. The gold doesn't matter. The knowing does." Robb was quiet for a moment. "That's a patient way of thinking." "Ned taught me it," Jon said. He turned away from the rock. "Send word to the Tarly lines. I'll want them ready on my signal." On the 4th day, Tywin's parley flag came down without replacement. His final response, delivered by a herald, was that Casterly Rock would not surrender its gates to a bastard regardless of what flew above him. Jon had been anticipating this since the first flag went up. He took the cannibals south over the Sunset Sea and came back along the coast, approaching the rock from the seaward face the cliffside, the sheer drop from the western walls to the water 300 feet below. There were no people on the seaward face. There had never been people there. It was not a wall guarding anything. It was a cliff the rock happened to have, which had always been presumed impregnable because no siege engine had the angle or the range to address it. The cannibals' fire, applied to the seaward cliff face, did not melt the stone. What it did was enter the existing fracture lines in the rock, the geological fault planes that every large stone formation carries inside it. Invisible until they are heated, and expand them. The rock did not dissolve. It disagreed with itself, along lines it had always secretly contained, and at 3 specific points along the seaward face, sections of cliff the size of houses separated from the main formation and fell into the Sunset Sea, and the passages they had been concealing opened into the cold air. Jon landed in the churning water below and climbed the rubble of the collapsed sections to the nearest passage. He did not send soldiers first. He had told every man on those walls what would happen if they fought, and he had told Tywin what he wanted, and the only way to make those words mean what he had intended was to walk through the breach himself and make them mean it in person. The passage was dark and smelled of old stone and salt water. The headache was returning as he moved deeper into the rock gradually. At its low familiar register, the bond's quiet signal muted by the distance from the cannibal and the massive stone between them. He followed the passages inward and upward by torchlight until the tunnels broadened into the worked interior of the mountain. And he followed the sounds of the household above until he found the great hall. Tywin Lannister was seated at the high table. He had not fled. He had not armed himself. He sat in his seat at the head of his hall the way he had sat in it for 40 years, with the complete occupancy of a man who understands that a seat is a statement, and who has never vacated a statement under pressure. 2 household guards stood at the entrance. They were ceremonial at this point, and they understood this, and they stood in silence. Jon walked to the center of the hall and stopped. Tywin looked at him with the expression that had been on his face all week, not contempt, not fear, not the performance of either. The expression of a master scholar presented with a problem his existing frameworks have not prepared him for, and who is examining the problem with genuine intellectual attention rather than the kind of attention that only wants to confirm what it already knows. He was 73 years old. His hair was white and thin. The authority in his face had not diminished with age, it had concentrated, the way things concentrate when they are reduced to what is essential. "What do you want?" Tywin asked. His voice was level and clear, the voice of a man who has given instructions in this hall since before Jon's parents were born. "The war ends," Jon said. "House Lannister bends the knee. Your remaining forces stand down. And in exchange? Every life in this rock is spared. Every member of your house who has not committed crimes against the crown lives. House Lannister survives." Tywin's eyes moved across Jon's face the way they would move across a document he was reading for the first time, and reading carefully. "You came through the breach alone," he said, "without guards, without a guarantee of your own safety. Yes, why? Because I said I would spare every life in the rock. If I send soldiers through the breach first, someone fights, someone dies, and my word means less than it did before I said it." Jon held Tywin's gaze. "I came through first, so that wouldn't happen." Tywin was quiet. He was looking at Jon with the specific quality of attention that Jon had seen in no one else, the attention of a man who has spent 40 years looking for the hidden mechanism in every statement made to him, the wire behind the gift, the obligation behind the offer, and who is now examining a statement and finding no mechanism. And who does not know what to do with that absence, because the absence is not something he has instruments for. "You mean what you say," Tywin said. It was not a question. It was the result of the examination. "Yes," Jon said. The silence that followed was the silence of Tywin Lannister, encountering something he had not encountered before, in 40 years of operating at the highest level of the realm's power. Not the dragon, not the breach in his impregnable walls, the bare fact of a man who meant what he said and had no hidden purpose and required no secondary interpretation. Tywin had built his life on secondary interpretation. He had no instrument for its absence. He stood. The movement was slow, his joints requiring negotiation that age imposes, and that Tywin bore with the particular expression of a man who finds physical limitation and imposition, but not a surprise. He came around the table, and he bent his knee on the stone floor of his family's hall. And the expression on his face communicated with total precision that he was performing a physical act, that the physical act did not represent a concession of will, that Tywin Lannister was aware of both of these things simultaneously and had made a calculation that this was nonetheless the correct thing to do. Jon reached down and helped him up. Tywin stood. He was shorter than Jon by more than a foot, and in this moment the difference in their heights was the least significant fact about either of them. He looked at Jon for a long time. "Your father would have been proud," he said. Jon looked back at him. "Which one?" The hall was very quiet. The two household guards at the entrance were very still. Tywin decided not to answer. The Ravens arrived during a council session on the terms of the Lannister surrender. The first one was urgent, the second was desperate. By the time the third arrived, the maester reading them had stopped speaking mid-sentence, and the fourth and fifth came together, and by the sixth, no one in the chamber was still seated. The wall had come down. Not crumbled from age, not scaled by any engine, not breached by any force the surviving Night's Watch had language for. The ancient magic that had held it the oath-bound sorcery of the Night's Watch's sworn brotherhood, eroding across decades as the Watch thinned from thousands to hundreds to the few dozen who remained, had failed the moment a White Walker host of sufficient size approached from the north, with the dead assembled behind them. The magic had been failing for years. The host provided the final increment. The wall 700 feet of ice and old sorcery that had stood for 8,000 years had come apart along its length in a collapse that the surviving brothers described only as the feeling of something vast ending. The Night's Watch had fallen back. The gift was already overrun. The cold moving south was not weather. Jon had been 3 weeks from a coronation. He had the realm. He had the Lannisters bent, the Lord's oaths recorded, the throne being prepared in King's Landing, while Ned supervised the ironwork. He had been close enough to peace that the taste of it had become real. The north is cold and full of whispers, and the winter that the Starks had warned about for 6,000 years had finally come to collect, and it had chosen its timing with the precision of something that had been watching and knew exactly when to arrive. Jon was on the cannibals' back within a day. The cannibals' response was not fear. Jon felt this clearly through the bond, a change in the dragon's quality since the first raven arrived, a particular alertness that was not the alertness he directed at threats or prey. This was older. The cannibal had been alive for 500 years and dormant for 160 before that, and the thing moving south from the former wall was not new to something that had witnessed the last long night's end. He did not need to be told what the dead were. He recognized them the way a man recognizes a smell from his deepest memory completely, without needing to name it. He knew what this was. The weeks of fighting north of the former wall compressed into sequences the histories afterward, rendered in vignettes, because the full account defied narrative that runs in a single direction. Jon commanded from above and below simultaneously. From the cannibal's back, he directed fire runs along the columns of dead streaming south lines of whites half a mile long that the dragon's fire addressed in single passes, the dead burning in the white silence of the north. He landed when the columns pressed too close against the living, when fire would take Stark bannermen and wildlings alongside whites, and fought on the ground with ice. And Valyrian steel through white bone and White Walker flesh was not the same transaction as Valyrian steel through anything living. At Jon's scale, with ice's weight, the dead stopped or shattered, and the stopping had a finality that human opponents did not. The combined forces held around him. Stark bannermen alongside what remained of the Night's Watch. Northern lords beside wildling fighters who had come south because Jon had sent ravens years ago, made promises, and kept them the slow accumulation of what happened when a man said what he meant across enough years that even the free folk decided to believe him. Jon did not hold these groups together through speeches. He was present among them, not behind them or above them. And in this kind of fighting his presence was its own argument. The Night King's encirclement completed on the morning of the third week, and it had been planned. Jon understood this as it happened, the columns of dead rerouting around his position over the preceding night, not lost, but directed, and the direction was deliberate. And the deliberateness confirmed what he had known in theory. The Night King had tactical intelligence. He had been watching. He had identified the center of the campaign and designed an approach to isolate it. Jon dismissed his guards an hour before the encirclement closed. He sent them south with orders to rejoin the Tully lines, repeated the order when they objected, and they went. He stood on the ice fields as dawn came gray over the northern horizon, with the cannibals circling above, and the circle of dead closing from 300 yards down to 200, and the Night King came through his own lines as the morning arrived. The Night King was assembled from the cold, in the way things from the deep past are assembled, not built, but accreted, layer by layer over time. He carried a weapon that was not precisely a sword, and when it moved the air before it arrived at temperatures that preceded the blade itself. The ground where he stepped was different from the ground he had not stepped on. They met at the center of the field. The Night King's weapon found Jon's left arm in the first exchange, and the cold it left was not weather cold. It was a particular cold, the cold of something trying to claim the material it had touched, and Jon's arm from the elbow down went numb in a way he had no attention available to assess. He shifted ice to a right-dominant two-handed grip and continued. The migraine returned. Not the old collision of the two signals. The Night King's unnatural cold was a third pressure, a third input. And Jon's body responded to overwhelming input the way it had always responded, by narrowing, by simplifying, by reducing the world to the geometry of what was in front of him and what ice could do about it. The pain clarified him. It always had. It always would. He fought the Night King for 20 minutes on the ice field, and the Night King could not beat him. Not for lack of trying. Not for lack of power. The exchange was genuinely even for the first 10 minutes, the Night King's weapon finding Jon's guard twice more cold burns on his right shoulder and ribs that would make themselves known later, fully, with interest Jon's swings absorbed by White Walker armor that had to be broken rather than penetrated. That took force differently from steel and required sustained application before it yielded. But the sustained application was available, because Jon did not tire at the rate the Night King required him to tire, and the dead at the perimeter could not close fast enough before the cannibals' fire held them back through the bond's quiet signal. And the Night King could not answer what Jon applied without the mass of the dead behind him, and the dead could not reach him in time. The Night King fell, not to a single blow to the accumulated mathematics of an opponent who could not be outlasted. He went down on the ice, as the force he could not answer finally exceeded what he could produce, and when he fell, the dead fell with him. Every wight within range dropped at once, the way candles drop when their source is removed, not died, ceased, the animate principle departing so completely that what remained on the ice field bore no resemblance to what had been standing a moment before. The ice field was very quiet. Jon stood in the quiet and breathed, and the cold burns on his arm and shoulder and ribs began their patient work of being noticed. He looked up at the cannibals circling. He looked at the horizon where the wall's remains sat against the sky. He began the walk back to his lines. Ned had supervised the reconstruction of the Iron Throne personally. He had replaced 2/3 of the original swords in the seat's frame with heavier gauge metal, widened the base, and anchored it into the floor with ironwork sunk 4 feet into the stone so that it could not tip under weight it had never been designed to hold. It was not the same throne. It was a throne that could hold the man who was going to sit in it, and Ned had decided the difference mattered. Jon sat on it once, during the ceremony, for the formal moment the ceremony required. He stood immediately after. He was not a man who sat comfortably in anything designed for smaller men, and the realm would learn to bring its business to a king who stood, and the realm would adjust, as it always had. Robert Baratheon was present. He was not yet 40, and the boar's tusk had left him with a scar along his ribs that troubled him in the cold, and the years since Jon had pulled him out of the undergrowth had not been kind years. But he was there, with the tenacious presence of a man too loud and too large to arrange his own absence. He sat in the place of honor to the throne's left, and he watched the ceremony proceed through its formal stages, and then in the moment when the Grand Maester was moving toward Jon with the crown, which was the plan, which everyone in the room understood to be the plan, Robert stood, and walked to the Grand Maester and took the crown from him and put it on Jon's head himself. No one stopped him. This was partly because no one stopped Robert Baratheon when he had decided to do something, and partly because the room understood without discussion that this was correct, that Robert crowning Jon was more true than the Grand Maester crowning Jon, in the specific way that some unplanned things are more true than the things they replace. Robert was weeping. Robert was grinning. He was, in that moment, the same man he had been at the Trident 18 years ago, a man too large for the world he had been given, who had spent those years unable to find anything commensurate with the size of what he carried, who had found in Jon Snow something finally large enough to match it. He clapped Jon on the shoulder once, firmly, the way he did everything, and stepped back and said nothing, because nothing was required, and Robert Baratheon, underneath everything, knew when nothing was required. Ned stood to the throne's right with his hands behind his back and watched his sister's son be crowned King of the Seven Kingdoms, and he did not weep because he was Ned Stark, and this was not the place for it. And the feeling he was managing was not grief anyway. It was older and more complete than grief. He stood and he watched, and he thought the writer enters his mind for this one final moment that Lyanna would have found all of this terrifying and wonderful and deeply inconvenient in exactly equal measure, and that this was the most Lyanna thing imaginable, to have set everything in motion from a tower in Dorne 17 years ago, with a dying breath and a promise extracted from her brother, and to have arranged, from that single point, every event that followed, and not to be present for any of it. He thought she would have laughed. He thought she would have been furious about the timing. He paid the cost of that thought, and stood straight. Jon I, King of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord of Dragonstone, the Winter King, looked out from the height of his rebuilt throne over the assembled lords of the realm, Starks and Tullys, Tyrells and Arryns, the surviving Lannisters standing in their appointed place, because Jon had promised every life in the rock, and his promises had always meant what they said and thought. The wall is down. The dead are defeated. Winter has come and been endured, and he had a headache. He had always had a headache. He was 17 years old. He had done all the things he had been made to do, and there were 1,000 more things waiting, and the headache was there at its familiar low register, the constant companion that had never left him, except for one night in a volcanic cavern when an ancient eye had opened in the dark, and the two halves of what he was had finally found each other and settled into their purpose. He looked out at the realm. He began. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.